I'm going to be talking, as you say, about a set of audio tapes in the collections of Churchill Archives Centre of two social researchers, Michael Young and Phyllis Willmott, in conversation about Michael's early life. And these are audio tapes that have been digitised thanks to Norfolk Record Office and to the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project. I thought I'd begin by introducing Churchill Archives Centre. We're located here at Churchill College, which was first envisaged in the 1950s and founded in 1960 after a national fundraising appeal and donations from companies, charitable foundations and trade unions, with the intention of memorialising Winston Churchill in a new college devoted largely to the study of science and technology at the University of Cambridge. Almost from the beginning, the college library collected archives of contemporary personal papers, including the archives of Winston Churchill and his family. A dedicated archive centre was opened in 1973, and today the collections include the archives of hundreds of individuals active in British politics and public life, mainly in the 20th century, and it has become a significant centre for the study of modern British history. The collections are open to all in our reading room in Cambridge and increasingly digitised online. These collections include the papers of a small group of social researchers, public policymakers and campaigners, including the two people I'm talking about today, Phyllis Willmott and Michael Young, who were lifelong friends and colleagues at the Institute of Community Studies in Bethnal Green. When they met in 1949, Michael was head of the Labour Party Research Department. Phyllis Noble was a newly qualified medical social worker and had recently met and married Peter Wilmot. In fact, they met during the course of Phil's social work training. She was trying to find a placement for a homeless man, and Peter was working in a homeless hostel in Lambeth. In 1949, Peter was about to cut short his degree at Ruskin College, Oxford, and return to London because the couple were expecting their first child. Their paths crossed with Michael Young when Peter wrote to him in response to his pamphlet, Small Man, Big World. Peter's letter caught Michael's eye. Michael invited him to meet and subsequently recruited him to the Labour Party Research Department. And so began a working partnership and a lifetime of collaboration. Michael and Peter went on to found the Institute of Community Studies in Bethnal Green together in 1954, where they initially carried out social research into housing, family and community in urban and suburban areas of East London and Essex. In fact, Michael had already been doing research in the Bethnal Green area for his PhD at the London School of Economics. And in 1957, they published their most famous book, Family and Kinship in East London. And only a year later, in 1958, Michael published his sole authored book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, which is now what he is most associated with. And the word meritocracy and the idea of meritocracy, which he popularized, has taken on a life of its own. Increasingly, the Institute became a base for social research, a centre for social action and innovation as a launch pad for new ideas and organisations. Some of the organisations in which Michael, Peter and the Institute were involved with have gone on to become enduring institutions, like the Open University, or the University of the Air, as it was first known, and the Consumers Association. And always in revisiting Michael's papers, one's struck by the sort of forward-thinking nature of many of his ideas. And certainly at this time last year, when we in Cambridge were switching to online learning, the ideas underlying the Open University distance learning, using the technology of the day, using television, learning on screen, all seem to be even more kind of visionary. Other organisations have been ephemeral, but whether enduring or ephemeral, these projects have ranged over a wide spectrum of public policy, including secondary and higher education, lifelong learning, housing, urban planning, poverty, inequality, race and migration, mutual aid and volunteering, health, old age and death. Michael and Peter carried on working together throughout their lives and also went off and pursued individual projects. Quite often they used each other as a sounding board for their ideas, and all of their work remained rooted really in the Institute of Community Studies. In addition, the two families became close. They socialized together, sometimes holidaying together. And for a brief period, sort of at the end of the 1960s, they became neighbours when the Youngs moved in almost next door to the Wilmots in Highgate. Phil also worked as a social researcher at the Institute of Community Studies, although she increasingly pursued an independent career as an expert on social work and social services, and as an activist campaigning on issues such as flexible working for women, daycare for children, disability rights, and child poverty. She was also a lifelong diarist, keeping a diary from 1938 until her death in 2013, and her diary is now preserved here at Churchill Archives Centre, and a published writer, most notable for the 4 volumes of memoir about her early life. Her childhood in a working class family in Lee in South London, her education at the Rowan Grammar School in Greenwich, her experiences as a young woman in the workplace and in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force during the Second World War, when she was a meteorological observer stationed at RAF North Creek in Norfolk. And I think this is significant because Phil's memoir project, documenting her own early life, largely before her diary keeping began, mirrors the project in the audio tapes to document Michael's early life, and also her experiences in life writing, her diary, memoir, biography, family history, fed into the oral history project, which also is a life writing project. And her commitment to life writing is evidenced in the oral history too. Turning to the audio tapes of Phyllis Willmott in conversation with Michael Young, the tapes were made in the year after Peter Wilmot's death in 2000, when Phil and Michael were grieving. And Michael, concerned about Phil, made regular visits to her home in Highgate. It was during the course of these visits, and in talking about the past, that they decided to make some more formal oral history recordings of Michael recalling his life before they had met. And in fact, on the tapes, they talk about how they both tried to remember where they were in 1939 at the declaration of the Second World War. And this in some way acted as a sort of catalyst for the idea of talking about Michael's life leading up to that point and then to their subsequent meeting in the post-war period. They recorded their conversations over several different visits, giving Michael the opportunity to reflect between sessions and return with further recollections. I haven't really hardly ever told anyone about those things that happened to me at that age, Michael Young says at one point on the tapes, and they do contain important biographical information about his early life, not replicated elsewhere in his extensive paper archive. But they also illuminate some more general themes of potential interest to researchers, the first being childhood, and his particular experiences of childhood growing up in Melbourne, Australia, and London, experiences which were characterized by loneliness and self-sufficiency as a result of his parents' neglect. However, in this first clip, he deliberately recalls happier memories. In fact, he came back at the beginning of the second recording session, very determined to speak about these happier memories, which date from the age of about 5 or 6, when he was living in the family's home by the sea in Melbourne, in the suburb of Parkdale.
Floating on my back in the lagoon near the house in Parkdale. Well, I was alone. I felt very alone, but I didn't feel quite alone because I was there in the sea, in these little waves, and I was pleased with myself in being able to float and float so well all around the place. I couldn't actually swim, but I could float nicely, and I looked up and I remember birds and the coral reef and not being afraid of sharks because of the coral reef. And I remember walking around the sand beaches and the dunes, and many times on my own I would rush out there from the house to get down there. I liked it so much, and I was like a much older person, I think, but enjoying it some way. But then there were various very good moments. I remember once going in the tram. There were trams in Melbourne then, and they worked on a cable, well, like the one to San Francisco, a cable in the middle of the road, and they pulled the tram along. on the end, and there was one tram that went all the way to the zoo. That was the terminus. And I was very pleased with the tram, and I was very pleased to know that it actually went to the zoo, and I got quite a lift of the spirit when I got out, and there was the zoo, and I was going into the zoo. I don't remember too much about the zoo on that occasion, but I remember being generally very pleased to be going on that nice outing.
I think those memories seem very authentic to me because he can't actually remember the zoo, but he remembers the trip on the tram to the zoo. And I remain slightly concerned that he was floating in the lagoon and not able to swim at that point. But to go back to the story, colonialism is another theme evident in Michael's recounting of his family history. His grandparents' family having been migrants to Australia during the gold rush and then being able to use their gold rush windfall to establish their prosperity and respectability, buying a newspaper and a printing business and property in Melbourne. And his grandmother's family were London Missionary Society missionaries in the Pacific region. There are also fleeting references to an aunt who taught at Achimota College in West Africa and was involved in the international progressive education movement. The theme of education encompasses his experiences of elementary schools in Australia and England, and the conventional, often inadequate and sometimes brutal regimes of English private boarding schools, prior to one of the great turning points of his life, when he transferred at the age of 13 to the progressive school founded by Dorothy and Leonard Elmhurst on their country estate at Dartington Hall in Devon. In this second clip, he describes that transformative event.
And always before, at every school I'd been to, they were organised into classes where people of more or less the same age were supposed to congregate and be taught together as though they were all uniform. And I suppose that being my background, the school should have been extremely surprising, the new Dartington School, because there were no real classes. Well, there were, but a few, and not compulsory. They were on offer rather than required. But it wasn't strange at all. It was as though I had come home somehow, almost from the beginning, because it was an ideal home. My own home made into a sort of utopia. Oh no, my own home isn't worse than that. I took to not having classes and enjoyed very much that, and boasted about it rather in the holidays as other children did. I mean, they made a kind of exaggerated how extremely free, liberated Dartington was, and people would gawk a bit, and we'd have a sort of one slight advantage over conventional adults. And I did, and I thought it was probably quite a well-known school. I think I might even had that in my mind because it was so extremely unconventional. But it wasn't mainly that, it was mainly that I was happy. Happy at school. It was an amazing thought.
His extensive recollections of Dartington Hall are rich in detail for histories of progressive education, utopian communities, and the global cultural milieu inhabited by Dorothy and Leonard Elmhurst, who became his patrons and sponsors. They funded his studies in London in the 1930s, where he became increasingly involved in Labour Party politics and left-wing political activism. In this final clip, he describes taking part in an anti-fascist protest outside of the House of Lords with his mother, Edith Young. Oh, and apologies, this clip is a bit quieter than the two earlier ones. Bear with me.
But it was a time when Hitler was on the ascendant. It was very exciting. I went to do all the demonstrations. Edith came with me to quite a few. I got frightened sometimes. And we were charged by the police. Once charged by the police in front of the House of Lords, and Edith cowered on the statue of Richard Coeur de Lion. It was in the courtyard of the House of Lords. And I stayed as close as I could to her to sort of vaguely protect her if I could. Luckily, the baton charge and so on somehow the horses found it rather difficult to deal with this great splints and all that, and we were fairly safe while it was all going on around us, the melee. Exciting and frightening.
What was the demonstration for?
Nearly all about Spain.
Oh, yes, that's sure.
Edith was very keen, so was I. We shout down all the way down Whitehall, "Non passeront! Non passeront!" which meant you will not pass. And
quiet apart from the bit at the end where Michael reenacts the chants on the demonstration. Finally, the recordings document his life in the Second World War, particularly his contribution to planning manpower policy on the home front when he was involved in devising the system of reserved occupations, which ensured the supply of key workers to vital parts of the economy, and to the continued provision of welfare services during the London Blitz. Later, his work as a labour and logistics manager in a naval munitions factory. And so the recordings end as they come full circle to the moment when Michael, Phil and Peter met. I'd like to conclude by bringing myself briefly into the story. When I came to the Archives Centre in 2003 to catalogue Michael Young's papers, Phil got in touch with me to offer the audio tapes to us as a gift. I went to Highgate to meet her, and that was the beginning of a very important friendship for me over the next decade. Phil gave me a transcript of the audio tapes at the time, which I remember reading on the train home. But until the tapes were digitised last year, no one was able to hear them. It was a moving experience during the first lockdown to be able finally to listen to the recordings, to hear Phil's voice again, and to hear Michael's voice for the first time. As someone who's new to oral history, it brought home to me the power and immediacy of the medium and the information recordings convey that cannot be conveyed on the printed page through the choice of language, tone of voice, pauses, laughter, exclamations, and interactions between interviewer and interviewee. And I know it was especially poignant, perhaps, to hear them at a time when many of us were separated from family and friends, anxious and alone with our thoughts and memories. Especially poignant to hear two old friends in a room together, talking in the context of a lifetime of shared experiences and affection, and reminding us of the importance of human connection. I'd like to close by acknowledging the work of my colleague, Chris Knowles, our digital archivist, who's made it possible for us to share these recordings online on our SoundCloud site, and with a number of other recordings which will be growing over the coming months. But above all, to thank Unlocking Our Sound Heritage and our colleagues at Norfolk Record Office for bringing Michael and Phil's voices, along with so many other voices, to life again out of the past. Thank you.